Sam Giancana, leader of the Chicago Mafia, clever, most powerful mobster in America.
He was a ruthless killer. That's why he rose up in the organization. He did what others couldn't do.
Arrested more than 70 times for assault, larceny, bombing, and murder, personally tortured some of his victims. Thought responsible for 200 killings.
He was magnetic. I thought he was special.
Sam Giancana sent a couple of his henchmen over to a barber shop to get a couple barbers in line. These were men who were harmless, wouldn't hurt anybody. These men went in, grabbed the two barbers, took out rubber hoses, baseball bat, brass knuckles, and proceeded to beat them bloody, break their fingers, and leave them lying in pools of blood, all at the wishes of Sam Giancana.
Sam Giancana was boss of the Chicago Mafia.
Who do you think killed Mr. Kane?
And without doubt, the most powerful gangster in America.
Mr. Giancana?
Killing someone made him feel more alive.
But what made Giancana different was not his violence, but his dreams. It's the ultimate story of organized crime in America. It begins in Chicago in 1915, under a tree. At age 10, the future gangster is led out of the family home and whipped.
Sam's father chained him to the tree in the backyard and would beat him with a strap, beat him to the point where he cried for mercy, would be exhausted and laying on the ground into the wee hours of the night before he was released by his father.
Compared with his poor father, who barely spoke English, or dry old Italian priests, gangster Al Capone was a much more potent role model.
He controls policemen, judges, and mayors.
Headquartered in the old Lexington Hotel, Capone exuded dark majesty.
His annual revenue is reported at over 100 million.
With police and judges in his pocket, Chicago was his captive city. The Patch was where poor Italians lived in Chicago. Expelled from school, Giancana was sent to a reformatory, then joined a street gang, the 42s. Barely more than children, they possessed a strange intimacy with torture and death.
Taking gang members, rival gang members, and we're talking rivals, we're talking about other ethnic groups, and they would literally torture them, burn them, break a leg, break arms, scar them, and leave them to be an example to other people.
The 42s included men like Mad Sam DiStefano, who in later life would slide ice picks into the brains of his victims. In such company, Giancana had to try hard to impress.
He explained he was an Italian boy, an Italian, in those days in Chicago, the Irish and the Polish were the people. He was a Dago, a Wop, a Guinea. They couldn't get any decent jobs. As he said, they were the low-grade white people. And he said, of course, he had no money. He had to do things like all the kids did. They wanted it. He had to steal it.
They called him Mooney, crazy. Prohibition provided the violent backdrop to Mooney's rise. He drove bootleg whiskey around Chicago.
Crime never pays.
In fact, the profits from bootlegging were phenomenal. There was open war between bootleggers and the law. Giancana was like an animal force, unleashed in the underworld, brutal but subtle.
Death on the electric chair. Public enemies #1 of the world, here is your throne.
For Giancana, the electric chair held no fears. He became a gun for hire, a freelance enforcer who killed to order.
From what I understand, yes, he put a few away.
Whatever messy demise Chicago gangsters prescribed for their enemies, Giancana would execute.
Shot him in the head, tortured a few, you know, the way it's usually done in the outfit.
Didn't bother him?
Not a bit.
Barely out of his teens, legend had it he'd killed 20 men.
He was a ruthless killer. That's why he rose up in the organization. He did what others couldn't do.
He told his brother he enjoyed killing.
Killing someone made him feel more alive.
But Giancana also knew when to stop. Violence was just a means to an end. The real prize was power. To win a place in the Capone gang, he betrayed his first boss, a gangster named Diamond Joe Esposito.
Sam and several other individuals made sure that Diamond Joe wasn't going to see the light of day anymore.
Yet according to the distorted code of the underworld, Giancana was no traitor. He obeyed the mafia's laws. To his brother, Giancana claimed he'd taken part in the most spectacular killing in gangland history, the St. Valentine's Day massacre of Al Capone's enemies.
Reminiscent of scenes 13 years ago when John Barleycorn was buried. Now at hotels all over, Old Man Prohibition is buried.
Bootlegging had made him rich.
Take it, Mr. and Mrs. America. Here it is.
The end of Prohibition was a disaster for Giancana. The most profitable criminal activity in America had vanished.
Look what I've got now.
Briefly jailed for bootlegging, Giancana met a stylish black gangster called Eddie Jones. Jones was king of the Policy Racket, a street lottery that had always been controlled by blacks. It brought in millions for the policy kings, but Giancana didn't feel black gangs deserved such profits.
You're talking about something like $250,000 to $500,000 a week.
Which was a staggering amount of money in those days.
It was absolutely that.
Eddie Jones was a millionaire several times over.
Suave, sophisticated, treated as an honorary white when he went into nightclubs.
By all accounts, Jones had everything Giancana wanted. A mansion in Mexico, a home in Chicago filled with antiques and gold, and clothes which made Giancana's look dowdy.
He probably didn't know there were any Negroes around like that until he met him in the jail.
Out of jail, Giancana cultivated his new black friend. He opened a nightclub called the Boogie Woogie, attracting black gangsters, including Eddie Jones.
So Eddie Jones thought Sam Giancana was his best friend?
Yeah, yeah.
One evening, Jones was kidnapped, flung in a car, and driven to Giancana's new home in the suburbs. Jones took the next train to Mexico, having agreed to turn over his entire gambling operation to Giancana. Evidently, Giancana had introduced him to a few realities.
Like, do you want to live? Or do you want your legs broken? And of course, from that point on, I mean, the word went out, and the policy game became white as opposed to black.
His daughters say Giancana dreamed a familiar dream.
The American dream. to own, to run a big business, a big corporation.
Except it was the dark side of the American dream.
That's true. Gambling, prostitution.
The nickels and dimes of the poor were making him rich. The spoils he lavished on his daughters.
Wonderful suits by Christian Dior. Wonderful fur coats. Some nice jewelry. Dancing, drinking, having a great time. I mean, it was almost like New Year's Eve every day or every night.
Giancana's daughters were fawned on by waiters and shop assistants. The source of the endless money didn't concern them at all.
Why should I have thought about where the money came from?
Didn't make it a little bit sour?
No.
The money?
No. It was there.
You spent it?
We did. I did.
During World War II, Giancana was called before the draft board, but he was declared a constitutional psychopath. Shortly afterwards, he was made an underboss in the Chicago Mafia.
He says murder, he says. Every time we're kids, he says murder, he says. At a time like this, he says murder, he says. Is that the language of love? He says solid, he says.
He took his family to Hollywood.
Solid, he says. Meaning all the time.
There were limousines and hotel suites littered with roses.
I mean, they stayed at, I think it was the Beverly Hills, who cares? One of the hotels, they had their own villa, and it was just great fun.
No, he gets on plainer than that. He says murder, he says.
They were taken on private studio tours by famous producers.
He had power. That's all I knew. He had power. Who questions power? I mean, I just enjoyed it.
That I sang for the memory.
Well, not everybody shows up at a Hollywood film studio.
That's right.
And by the head of the studio.
That's true. That was a great feeling. I loved it.
Until you're in my arms once more. Saturday night is the loneliest night of the week.
The family got used to seeing Giancana with stars like Sammy Davis and especially Frank Sinatra.
It was a cordial, wonderful relationship. I mean, these two guys used to hug each other and kiss each other upon, you know, my father entering the room.
Until I hear you at the door.
Not for years did they realize the source of their father's power in Hollywood. Chicago controlled the film unions and could stop production, terrorize producers, and extort money from studios. A mobster who spilled the beans on the Hollywood connection was blown to pieces in his car, probably on Giancana's orders. When 35 leaders of the American Mafia met secretly in Havana, Giancana, the new Chicago underboss, was among them. It was the first time he'd sat at the Mafia's high table. His legend was terrifying. He both intimidated and cajoled.
He thought that everything could be fixed, and I believe it could. In those days, you could. I believe that you could commit murder in this city, and if you knew the right person and you had the right amount of money, you could walk away from it.
To Sam Giancana, the great and the good were puppets. He owned them, so he despised them. They were worse than criminals because they were hypocrites. He understood, or thought he did, the nature of power. And it gave him a godlike feeling. He knew what the public didn't. There were no white hats or black hats, good men or bad men. There were just men. And men you couldn't buy, you killed. Union official Joe Longmire was horribly injured by a car bomb. He thinks the bomb was planted on the direct orders of Giancana.
The nuts and bolts were as familiar to him as a plate of spaghetti. He really, he thrived on hearing stories of people who were tortured and what their last words were and that kind of material. Yeah, he loved it.
The Mafia threatened union leaders, give us control or die.
Straightforward, no questions. If you didn't get the message, then what happens is the union official's body winds up in the trunk of his car, and it only takes 2 or 3 of those examples, and people take guys like Sam Giancana seriously.
Transport unions were best for Giancana. He could squeeze businesses by cutting their supplies.
He could pretty much shut down a city the size of Chicago.
Unions were Giancana's path to real national power. The more local unions he controlled, the tighter his grip on Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters.
If you think of a pumpkin pie, Jimmy Hoffa was a pumpkin pie that was cut into 8 or 10 pieces, and Sam Giancana had one of those 8 or 10 pieces.
The Teamsters pension fund, controlled by Hoffa, became a piggy bank for Giancana.
Hoffa did, in fact, authorize the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund to give representatives of Sam Giancana literally hundreds of millions of dollars to build casinos in Las Vegas.
Now the undisputed head of the Chicago Mafia, Sam Giancana's empire stretched hundreds of thousands of square miles to Las Vegas and the Pacific.
He wanted to control the world.
Literally.
Yes.
Giancana reveled in his own legend. He possessed an intoxicating combination of money and absolute fatal power.
He was magnetic. I thought he was special.
His frail Italian wife, who'd never strayed and never dared question him, had died. Alone in Las Vegas, he fell in love.
Be really refreshed.
Phyllis McGuire, lead singer with the McGuire sisters, was America's sweetheart.
King size Coke has more for you. Get value, live refreshment too. King size.
She dated Elvis Presley, but Sam Giancana was the real thing.
King size Coke has more for you. Get value, live refreshment too.
He had a lot of charisma, charismatic personality.
Yeah.
And he wasn't flashy. It was just direct, and it was strength, and his eyes were, it's like they looked through you.
The press was fascinated. She as pure as the driven snow. He, evil incarnate. Wherever the sisters went, the gangster followed, from Vegas to London to Rome.
When we were in Italy, he didn't want to go to Sicily. I don't know why, but he didn't want to go.
Las Vegas was the mob's domain, and Giancana was one of its princes. The Chicago bosses, like the other big mafia families, had bought casinos with money from the Teamsters Pension Fund. J. Edgar Hoover could no longer pretend the mafia didn't exist, especially when police discovered its entire national leadership in a secret meeting in upstate New York. Much too late, Hoover acted. He sent fleets of G-men in suits and ties to fight the mafia. Agent Bill Romer was sent to Chicago to deal with the legendary Sam Giancana. The city seemed to him like occupied territory, its police and judges controlled by the enemy. Romer became obsessed by Giancana. He volunteered to hide a microphone in a tailor shop Giancana used for meetings. Such methods were officially forbidden. Had he been caught, the FBI would have disowned him.
I was what we call the case agent. I had the ticket, the assignment card, and so I led the entry into the headquarters of the Chicago mob that very first time.
Mr. Giancana?
The bug gave Romer X-ray vision into Giancana's world. He inhabited a strange parallel universe that mimicked the straight world. It was highly organized with its own hierarchy and disciplines. Sometimes Giancana sounded efficient, managerial. Other times, almost insane.
In my opinion, Sam Giancana breached the limits of rationality.
I'm putting it forward then as an original thesis that Mr. Harper, surrounding himself with witnesses...
In the late 1950s, before he became president, Senator Jack Kennedy and his brother Bobby interrogated mafia racketeers. Sam Giancana, however, seemed unafraid. He was used to owning politicians, and the Kennedys, he thought, would be no different, just bigger flies in his web. Joe Kennedy, the boy's father, was a veteran like himself of bootlegging days. Joe Kennedy made part of his fortune smuggling whiskey. In the late 1950s, Giancana claimed that at this hotel in Chicago, Joe Kennedy asked for his help. He wanted his son Jack to run for president. Could Giancana use his corrupt political power to swing the vote in Chicago or anywhere else?
At that meeting, Joe Kennedy specifically told my uncle that if he does this for him and Jack Kennedy is elected, if he helps him get Jack Kennedy elected, that Sam Giancana will have the ear of the president, that they would be able to have business the way they really wanted it, that they could have the government off their back.
Did you say that SOB, I'll break his back?
Jack's brother Bobby Kennedy laid into mafia leaders and their union friends with messianic zeal.
After these people testified before the committee.
Tracked down in Las Vegas, Giancana was subpoenaed and torn into by Bobby Kennedy, who would eventually become his mortal enemy.
Would you tell us whether if you have opposition from anybody that you dispose of them by having them stuffed in a trunk? Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana?
Decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate.
Will you tell us anything about any of your operations, or you just giggle every time I ask you a question?
Decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate me.
I thought only little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana.
Giancana seemed oddly unruffled. In the Las Vegas underworld, rumors of a behind-the-scenes deal with the Kennedys didn't surprise businessman Ed Becker.
Because they were tied in. Joe Kennedy was tied in with the mob.
Joe Kennedy had tied his sons into the world of Sam Giancana.
By osmosis, yes.
Giancana really imagined he owned the Kennedys.
That's what we were led to believe.
Who led you to believe that?
Sam.
We've got the Kennedys.
They're in our pocket. We own them. What other guy could you rather have in your pocket but the president? Me, I thought it was a little ridiculous that but then again, hey, if this is possible, we got a hell of a thing going.
Joe Kennedy understood the power of organized crime to mobilize votes and fix results. In New York, in the 1960 election year, he was reportedly seen lunching with a succession of top mobsters. FBI files record similar meetings. If he did seek the mob's help in the election of his son, Joe Kennedy made the most dangerous deal imaginable.
Sure, because you're dealing with psychopathic people.
Who believe that they are critical to your election.
Absolutely. There's no free lunch in the mob.
Just before the election, the Chicago wards he'd most thoroughly corrupted, Giancana sent out his soldiers to rustle up votes for Kennedy.
We were told by Sam to go out there and get all the Italian people and the Irish and the Polacks and get their votes, tell them what the Kennedys could do for us, that we needed this guy in the office. I never let them know that it would help organize crime, but I just let them know that it would be good for them. So we went out there and we pushed for votes. We sent people out, all the old greaseballs and Polacks, we sent them all out there. We talked to people, and they all voted for Kennedy.
The election was incredibly close. Nationally, Kennedy scraped in by 0.1%.
He was ecstatic. He says, I got that man his vote.
The state of Illinois was critical, and Kennedy won it by just 9,000 votes.
Senator Kennedy will be the next president of the United States.
Victory, Giancana believed, belonged to him. Whether Giancana actually tipped Kennedy's election is one of the imponderables of history. The point is, he thought he did. In Cuba, Fidel Castro had seized power, closed the casinos, and thrown out the mafia.
Then the temper of the throng changed, and an ugly mob ranged the streets. Its prime targets, the symbols of the overthrown regime.
Giancana had lost millions. Giancana had reason to be confident in his relationship with the United States government. The CIA had invited him to take part in a bizarre plot to murder Fidel Castro. The mafia were the fall guys. If the operation was discovered, they, not the government, would take the blame. The prize, the return of their Cuban casinos. The idea was put to Johnny Rosselli, Giancana's man in Hollywood, by a CIA contact.
He thought I was kidding at first. Then he became stupefied. And after a few more drinks, he knew I was telling the truth.
At a meeting in Miami, Rosselli and his boss, Sam Giancana, agreed to kill Castro.
I became convinced very early on that both Rosselli and Giancana were doing this as good Americans.
Giancana brought in his ally, Santo Trafficante, the mafia chief of Florida. Secretly, Trafficante thought the whole thing was crazy, but hoped to squeeze money out of the CIA. Panicked by Castro's communist ties, the CIA's Health Alteration Committee came up with lethal viruses and poison so the mafia could kill him without a trace.
What do you think of your reception?
They had exploding cigars and chemicals to make his beard fall out.
They convinced me that we were involved in a just war. It was imperative that Castro be eliminated.
Giancana and his CIA friends stayed at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. They had caviar flown in daily.
I was putting myself in a terrible position as the sole conduit between the underworld and the United States government.
The government told Giancana some of its deepest secrets.
Cuban exiles.
Miami seethed with intrigue.
Coral Gables. All day they've been seen.
The CIA was planning to invade Cuba with an army of Cuban exiles. It persuaded Castro's former mistress to go back to Cuba and slip poison pills into his drink. But once in Cuba, she lost her nerve. The CIA's invasion of Cuba failed too. Fearing exposure of America's involvement, at the last minute, President Kennedy called off the U.S. air cover the invaders had been promised. They were arrested or shot. The mafia chiefs, like the defeated Cuban invaders, were infuriated by Kennedy's empty promises.
I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
Kennedy blamed the CIA for the failure. The CIA and the mafia blamed him. Sam Giancana was bitterest of all. In his worst nightmares, he never expected Bobby Kennedy to be made Attorney General. Instead of thanking him, Kennedy was furious the CIA had used a gangster in a secret operation. Far from going easy on organized crime, he set out to destroy it. This was a disaster for Giancana. The criminal career of Sam Giancana was faltering.
I said, take a look at this guy, this scum, this piece of slime. This is Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago mob, the successor to Al Capone. Just look at this jerk. You people are so lucky. You just are traveling through Chicago. We have to live with this slime. Well, nobody had ever talked to Sam Giancana like that. And as a result, he just blew his stack and he said, Romer, he said, you lit a fire tonight that's never going to go out. We're going to get you if it's the last thing we ever do.
Giancana had suffered the most extraordinary reverse. been involved in a deep government secret. He thought he had the Kennedys in his pocket. In fact, he was running from them like a rat. Many racketeers now smoldered with hatred for the Kennedys. Giancana himself, his union friend Jimmy Hoffa, his co-conspirator in the Castro plot Santo Trafficante, all had been targeted by Bobby Kennedy for prosecution.
But 3 quick shots shattered this day, November 22nd, 1963.
Sam Giancana told my father that we took care of Kennedy together, that elements of the CIA, along with members of the mob, joined together to assassinate the President of the United States, that they each had equal reason to make sure that Kennedy did no longer remain in office. Specifically, that Kennedy was upset at the CIA, and obviously the mob was very upset at Kennedy.
Wishful thinking, maybe, but at least one official inquiry, that of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, did conclude there probably was a conspiracy, perhaps headed by a powerful ally of Giancana, the mafia boss of New Orleans, Carlos Marcello.
If there was a plot, and I think there was, the most plausible explanation of the evidence is that organized crime, in particular, Marcello in New Orleans, had a hand in the assassination.
The evidence connecting the mafia to the assassination was circumstantial, but intriguing. 2 days before Kennedy was shot, a New Orleans bar girl was admitted to a hospital where she made startling claims to doctors.
She said it was very common knowledge in the underworld figures in New Orleans that there was a contract out on John F. Kennedy and that he would be assassinated. She gave no specifics, but she made it very clear, and she told a number of the staff in the hospital there that this was going to happen before it happened.
She worked in a bar in New Orleans owned by the family of Carlos Marcello, the city's mafia chief, and a longtime associate of Sam Giancana. In mid-1963, on his huge private estate in the swamps outside New Orleans, Marcello told several witnesses the mob intended to kill the president.
I'm thinking, well, here's a vendetta where he is like saying he's going to kill somebody. And so I'm saying, you're not, how are you going to do that? You can't do a thing like this. And he says, you get a nut to do it for you.
He said that?
Yeah.
You get a nut?
You just get a nut to do it. There's nobody bothers you. You just get a nut to do it.
Was Lee Harvey Oswald the mafia's nut? It's Patsy? The House Select Committee heard that the man who raised Oswald, his uncle, worked for Marcello. They also heard Santo Trafficante told an associate, the president will be hit. The House Select Committee thought the background of Jack Ruby had never been properly investigated by the Warren Commission. In fact, Ruby was linked with the Chicago Mafia.
Another camera, the motion is slowed.
I think that Jack Ruby is the Rosetta Stone for the assassination. And once you connect Ruby immediately to organized crime, you then turn back and say, can I connect Oswald to organized crime? And the answer is yes.
Just before the assassination, Ruby phoned mobsters all over the country, including men close to Giancana.
The President of the United States is dead.
All Giancana was heard to say by an FBI bug was that Lee Harvey Oswald had been a very good shot.
He got what he deserved, as far as he was concerned.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
From jail in Dallas, Ruby appealed over and over again to be moved to Washington. He had something important to say and didn't feel safe in Texas. But the Warren Commission ignored his pleas. Many years later, mobster Santo Trafficante, upon learning he was dying, allegedly made a confession to his lawyer.
He said to me, he says, Carlos really effed up. I said, we should have killed Bobby instead of Giovanni, meaning they should have killed Bobby Kennedy instead of John Kennedy. Santa would withhold information from me, but in the 27 years that I represented him, and he was a friend of mine, I've never known him to lie to me. He would never lie.
Regardless, Robert Kennedy was haunted by the fear his war on organized crime provoked his brother's murder.
If the mob was not involved in the assassination, they were nevertheless the chief beneficiaries of it. The organized crime program that had not up until that time even come close to what he put together basically collapsed. The organized crime program died in Dallas on November the 22nd.
If he did flirt with the mob, Joe Kennedy had unlocked the darkest forces imaginable. The criminal career of Sam Giancana was threatened. Mobsters thought his affair with Phyllis McGuire attracted too much heat, but he refused to relinquish her.
The mob thought he was a weakling because he's getting so much publicity. I mean, here he is with this star.
No comment. I'm sorry.
Why no comment?
No comment.
And
My attorney
everywhere they went, photographers are waiting, and along with the photographers were the FBI, and the FBI would grab her and try to question her. The mob had no faith. They have no faith in women. They figured they're going to be tortured and scream. But she stood up to it all. But the mob didn't. They were very upset with it.
Jailed for contempt of court, Giancana seemed suddenly old, even vulnerable. In 1966, he was released and slipped into exile in Mexico, taking with him millions of dollars. He chose a town in the mountains above Mexico City, with blue skies and clouds of bougainvillea. Large payments were certainly made to powerful men in Mexico City to protect him, to provide sanctuary. He bought a $5 million estate called San Cristobal and shut himself away at the top of the house.
He could sit there for hours and hours and hours and just look out and never budge.
He would have telescopes in his upper room and looking out and seeing the poverty, and not only that, he used the telescope to see if there were any government people looking in onto his home.
He'd often said the time a man has to watch out is when he becomes frail and lets his guard down.
The mob is an organism. It's a growing organism. And if you're not there to water the plants or take care of the plants, somebody else is going to do that. And pretty soon they feel he's unstable, and they're watching all the time. I mean, I don't care where he was, somebody was watching Sam.
Perhaps he hadn't paid the Mexicans enough. One morning in 1974, when he was tending his cactus garden, Mexican police raided his estate and dragged him to the U.S. border.
Mr. Giancana, why did you have to leave Mexico, sir?
Why? I don't know.
I finally thought, well, you know, he'll come back and we'll be a family. But
Mr. Giancana, what are your future plans here?
In 1975, he was called before a Senate committee investigating the CIA plot to kill Castro. The night of June 19th, 2 escorts had just arrived in Chicago to take him safely to Washington. Neither his caretaker nor police officers watching his house heard the 6 shots that killed Sam Giancana at midnight on June the 19th, 1975. He'd been cooking sausages and late that evening opened the door to a visitor. A few minutes later, he was dead, shot in the head and the chin. Perhaps somebody believed he would blurt out the truth about the Castro operation at the hearings in Washington. Not long afterwards, the dismembered body of Johnny Rosselli, Giancana's partner in the Castro murder plot, was found stuffed in an oil drum in the sea off Miami. Giancana always said that if you want to find the murderer, look for the one who survives. The mob's only survivor from the plot to kill Castro was Santo Trafficante, the mafia chief of Florida.
They were afraid he was going to talk, the same as Roselli. Roselli's going around shooting his mouth off, and they were killed within months of each other. I think it was the Trafficante people got the okay from Chicago.
Like so many who live in a world of secrets, Giancana, perhaps in the end, understood less about the world than he thought he did. Finally, his darkest dreams of real political power came to nothing. His funeral was an oddly muted affair. The mobsters who once fawned on Giancana stayed away. His family was bitter.
They really practically beat up on the press. Can't we mourn in peace without having the trash around?
But he was the biggest mobster this city has ever produced.
Yeah, and the smallest funeral that the mob has ever had.
Because his great friends didn't show up.
That's right.
Why?
They were probably the guilty ones.
He was buried in a marble mausoleum he built for his wife, next to the father who beat him.